Happy International Equal Pay Day. My name is Kyra Eubanks, and I am the Youth Representative for New Future Foundation to United Nations and the co-chair of the United Nations Department of Global Communications Civil Society Youth Representative Steering Committee. Welcome, everyone. As you join, please keep your microphone muted so that our event can be heard clearly. I had the pleasure of being formally introduced to the incredible work that the Equal Pay International Coalition, or EPIC, has been doing when I moderated the Department of Global Communications youth-led briefing, Equal Work, Equal Pay, Reducing the Gender Gap, this year as a parallel event to the 66th session of the UN Commission on the Status of Women. It was there that I got acquainted with the mission of EPIC and the work that the coalition has been doing to shed awareness on practical ways that governments, the private sector, employers, and workers' organizations, as well as civil society, can truly take action to ensure equal pay for work of equal value. Curious and inspired to learn more about how EPIC has been addressing the gender pay gap, I did my own research. Although most governments all over the world have legislated to guarantee equality of treatment between men and women and remuneration, and even though the ILO Equal Remuneration Convention 1951, number 100, enjoys a 93% ratification rate, the gender pay gap still persists. Globally, women on average are paid about 20% less than men. One tool that EPIC has been promoting to help to reduce and eliminate the gender pay gap is actually through pay transparency, which is open communication and access to salary or wage compensation to ensure that individuals receive equal pay for work of equal value, regardless of their gender. Presently, 38 countries around the world have implemented pay transparency as part of the legislative policies or have encouraged companies to disclose information on salary and compensation to current and prospective employees. However, we believe that more needs to be done and questions still remain, like how can pay transparency measures help to reduce the gender pay gap? On behalf of the Equal Pay International Coalition, I hope that today's event can serve as an informative and illuminating opportunity to delve into this topic, and that our esteemed panelists and speakers can provide answers to this question and more. Please note that today's event can be interpreted in English, French, Spanish, and sign language, and that captions are also available. Please click on the globe icon at the bottom of the screen for all interpretation and caption options. We ask that all audience members mute their mics at this time. But before we officially begin, and as we wait for others to join our event from all around the world, please watch our brief video, A Curtain Raiser on Pay Transparency.
Why does the gender pay gap still exist? Because the many factors contributing to the gender pay gap still persist. Pay transparency legislation and policies can be a tool to achieve equal pay for work of equal value. And pay transparency legislation has become one of the tools for exposing the reasons behind the gender pay gap. Glass ceiling, glass wall, feminized sectors, discrimination, care penalty. Legislation promoting pay transparency reveals gender bias or pay discrimination. Pay transparency helps employers and workers address the gender pay gap. Reveal the gap to close the gap.
Now that the curtain has officially been raised, we are ready to begin our program. Our first speaker for today's event is Mr. Rakesh Patri, Director General of International Intergovernmental Labour Affairs for the Government of Canada's Department of Employment and Social Development and the Chair of the EPIC Steering Committee. Welcome, Mr. Patri, and thank you for being here.
Thank you, Cairo. Pleasure to be here.
It's a pleasure to have you here, Mr. Patri. To provide context on EPIC, the Equal Pay International Coalition is a multi-stakeholder coalition of governments, employers, workers, and their organizations the private sector, international civil society, organizations, and academia, which aims to achieve equal pay for men and women everywhere. Mr. Patry, can you please tell us more about the coalition's scope of action and how it contributes to closing the gender pay gap?
Well, thank you very much, Cairo. And first of all, good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone, wherever you're joining us from. It's an honor to be a part of this terrific panel, group of panelists and speakers that we have here today. So thank you for your question. And I guess what I would say is this coalition, EPIC, really does help to address the gender pay gap in many ways. As a coalition led by major international actors responsible for advancing gender equality, namely the ILO, the OECD, and UN Women, EPIC really helps to raise awareness on the importance of advancing pay equity and pay transparency on the international stage. And one of the most practical ways to do that is to organize events such as this one, in addition to other key activities led by EPIC, which really aim to share good practices and highlight measures that have proven to be successful in some countries, to learn from one another, and to facilitate access to sound data and exchanges between countries that really could help policy development on these issues. Another key strength of EPIC is its tripartite nature. And those of you that are engaged with the ILO will know what that means. For others, what it really means is it's governments, employers, and workers' organizations all engaged together on equal footing in this platform to address gender inequality. Dialogue and cooperation between the governments and those two social partners really helps to promote consensus building for those with vital stakes in the world of work. And I should add that in addition to employers' organizations, individual businesses are also welcome from around the world to join the coalition. And in my view, we could really all benefit from greater engagement from the private sector in EPIC. They really need to be a part of this solution.
I completely agree. And Canada has been a member of the EPIC Steering Committee since its launch in 2017 and has been chairing the coalition since the beginning of 2022. Can you please tell us more about how Canada has benefited from this membership? Maybe perhaps provide some words of encouragement for other governments and labor market actors on why EPIC is worth joining.
Well, I'd be happy to. Thank you, Cairo. I mean, being a member of EPIC has really been a great and I would say a rewarding journey for Canada. The issues of equal pay and gender equality are of primary importance in Canada. And in recent years, we have made significant changes to our pay equity regime, and we're now implementing innovative measures in pay transparency as well. And through our membership in EPIC, we've learned so much from other countries on the approach that they have been taking and on lessons learned from their own experience as well. We're also very pleased with the fact that our Canadian Employers Organization, the Canadian Employers Council, as well as our workers organization, the Canadian Labour Congress, are also members of EPIC, and that Canada really counts on and demonstrates a tripartite representation within EPIC as well. I would also like to take this opportunity to extend an invitation to governments, unions, businesses, employers organizations, international organizations that are really interested in working together in reducing the gender pay gap to consider becoming a member of EPIC. Stakeholders from all regions of the world need to continue to work.
Excuse me, Mr. Patry, it's a little hard to hear you. If you could please move your mic further up, as well as to speak a little slower so that our interpreters can be able to interpret your responses. Thank you.
Happy to do so. Is that a bit clearer then?
If you could just enunciate, just project a little bit more.
Sure, I'll try and do so. Hopefully this is better. What I was saying is that stakeholders from all regions of the world really need to continue to work together to ensure that everyone has a fair and an equal chance to succeed. And I think as a result of this pandemic, longstanding gender inequities have only been amplified and have really put decades of hard-fought gains for women in the workplace at risk. Addressing this growing inequality is really everyone's responsibility, and we must all join forces together in order to do so. Hopefully, the pandemic would have put greater awareness on the need for governments, workers, and employers to address gender inequality in the world of work, and to do so now. Discussions must continue to be held between relevant stakeholders. Good practices must be shared. Initiatives like this must continue to be implemented. And this is really where EPIC and all of its members around the world have a key role to play. So I really would encourage organizations, governments, businesses to really consider joining EPIC and allow us to work together in achieving this goal. Thank you.
Thank you. And we'll actually be sharing how you can become an EPIC member towards the end of our event. So please definitely stay tuned. Mr. Rakesh, interestingly enough, you are the only male speaker for today's event. We made an effort to have a diverse panel, and it just so happens that our next speakers and panelists who've been nominated from their countries and organizations happen to be all women. However, as you are well aware, equal pay is an issue that affects both men and women. Mr. Patri, thank you for the work that you are doing as the chairperson of EPIC.
Thank you very much.
Now, you're very welcome. Now, at this time, we will now transition to hear from representatives of the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD, and the International Labor Organization, ILO. Each representative will present an overview of reports and findings from their respective organizations. We will first begin with the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. Representing OECD is Monica Kaiser, the Senior Counselor to the Director of Employment for the Labor and Social Affairs Directorate and the Head of Social Policy Division at the OECD. Ms. Kaiser, it's a pleasure to have you today. And my first question for you is, can you please share some of the key findings of the OECD's recent reports on pay transparency? And we ask that you please speak slowly so that our interpreters can interpret properly.
Thank you so much, Cairo. And let me also give you all a warm welcome on behalf of the OECD. I'm absolutely delighted to be here. EPIC is an extremely important initiative for us at the OECD. And let me also follow up on one thing you just said, Cairo. We actually at the OECD, our organization-wide gender champion, the Deputy Secretary General, is a man, is Ulrik Knudsen from Denmark. And so we're very pleased to have a male gender champion. And I believe you're absolutely right. We have to be very careful that it's not just women talking to other women. And that's why I'm also so grateful to have Rakesh there as our chair of EPIC at the moment. So that's wonderful. Now, I would like to show you a few slides that our team has prepared. And let me also acknowledge the two people who've really all been doing all of the work for EPIC here and who are well known from the start. That is Willem Adema, another man, and Valentina Patrini. So thanks to both of them. Now, let me quickly run you through some of the findings that we have been able to develop in a recent report that we did on pay transparency. And what was interesting is echoing what you were saying before and what Rakesh was saying, it is something that is becoming much more interesting to countries now. We've had active interest, and we had, in this case, the interest from the government of Sweden that came to us and said, please, we want to find out more on what pay transparency initiatives and tools exist in member countries and how they work. And we're actually, this is only the first part of a larger initiative. We are following up. Next year, we will be working very intensely on a second round, updating this because so many countries are changing their policies in this respect, and also looking more at what works and what doesn't. So with this, let me start with the first slide on what it is that we're talking about when we say pay transparency. So there's very many different forms of pay transparency tools, but I think the common idea we should highlight here is that it is so important, it has become so important to give more information. Because remember, in some countries, it was even illegal for workers to ask other workers, never mind you men or women, how much money they're making. I mean, that's how far we're coming from. And we all know the examples of even movie stars who find, or CEOs who find out they take a job, they negotiate their pay, and a couple of months down the road, they discover that the previous person who held the job and who was a man often made a lot more in exactly the same position. So these are, of course, things which are very important for the gender pay gap at all levels, whether we're talking about more basic jobs or all the way up to CEOs. So this is why it's so important. And so we've identified 4 different ways of pay transparency tools. One is the employer pay gap reporting, which means that you just say, you look at you have a software, and then you look at the differences between men and women in your company, and you report it. The next step would be the equal pay auditing processes. That's a little bit more stringent. This is really, as the word says, audit. You kind of check, and then you could also sanction. If things aren't happening, you could require from employers, okay, this is not good enough, so please give us a plan. What are the next steps? How do you intend to address this? And if they're not getting there, you could sanction them financially, for example, which is what some countries are doing. Then, very interesting, you also have the job evaluation and classification systems, which are trying to get away from this idea that there's male things and female things. So what you do is you say, no matter who gets the job, this is what the job requires. This is what the job should pay, no matter what the background of the person is that takes this job. This is actually quite interesting, not only in terms of gender, because you could take this further. You could even say, no matter what somebody's educational background is, if you have a PhD or a bachelor's, you should be paid the same money if you do this type of job, you know? So it's a very interesting concept, which exists in several countries, including countries that are members of EPIC. So that's great, because we're learning from them. And then, of course, you have the discussion of equal pay in collective bargaining, which is another very important issue. Now, we know that in collective bargaining, there's many other issues. And I remember a few years ago talking to female trade union leaders who were saying, by the time that gender issues get on the table, or family policy or family-friendly work practices, they've already discussed everything else, and there's not much energy for this anymore. So this is also a big challenge for many of the female trade union leaders to make sure that the gender gap issue is also on the table. So on the next slide, please. Here's just a little overview of which different countries have these different approaches. And so if you start at 12 o'clock noon on this chart, and you go to the right, those are the most stringent forms, and then we go all the way around to the remaining OECD countries which have nothing. I'm not going to go into detail here, but you can see that in this most stringent part, so that means that those are companies that must conduct regular gender pay audits, and they have to report gender disaggregated pay. So you see that there's already 2, 4, 6, 8, 10 countries here, which is quite substantial. And then there's other forms. You will be able to look at the report where you find all the description. So you can see that very many countries now are active in this space. And we, of course, hope that the white pie part here is also going to move and have more stringent or more pay transparency tools. So the next slide, please. How does this work? Well, there's countries that want to introduce it, or social partners that want to introduce pay gap reporting. They need to make several decisions on what indicators they want to use. So you can report the overall gender wage gap in a company, or you could report the wage gap in different job categories. Now, obviously, if you really want to do something about it, if you're serious about changing the situation, you need more disaggregated information. So the overall gender wage gap probably is not going to help you all that much. So we're all for kind of drilling down deeper, really understanding where these differences come from. Who reports? Usually this is determined by company size. So usually most countries that started to introduce these things, including France, for example, you start with bigger companies, because for them it's usually a little bit easier. And then you go down, and at some point you require very small companies to do that as well. Now, very small companies that only have 3 employees, obviously for them it's going to be easy again. But so it's usually there's a degree of how stringent you want to do it and introduce it over time. Then there's a question who gets the information, whether it's the workers representatives, whether you need to report this to a government body, which could potentially sanction, or if you want to name and shame publicly, which can be quite effective also when you show the public which companies are doing well or not. And that's been very interesting. I don't know if you've been following the wage pay transparency reporting in the UK, where in the Financial Times almost every day there were articles about which companies were doing horribly badly. And it does leave a mark. You know, you do remember that. And I think it can be quite an effective way for companies to say, no, we really need to do better here. On compliance, as I said before, there's different ways to do this. You could ask companies to pay fines, but you could also, for example, restrict government tenders. You can say, if you're not doing better on this, you cannot bid for a government contract. So that can be quite a strong restriction for some companies that participate in government tenders. Obviously, if you're a very small company, you never do this, that's not going to help much, but you probably need various forms of penalties and compliance monitoring. Next one. What works and what doesn't? Well, as we said before, the pay reporting has the potential to reduce the wage gap, and it's not been in existence for so long, so we don't have that much evidence yet. But in a few countries, we do see that the pay gap has been going down, for example, the UK and Denmark. And obviously, if you're not enforcing it, this policy, it's not going to help much. So not surprisingly, we see much less action where either there's no enforcement or where people don't know about it. But we, as I said before, we need more and better evaluations, and we at the OECD are on the way of doing this to understand what the effects on the gender wage gap are. Sometimes we've been seeing, for example, that pointing it out will lead to not higher wages for women, but lower wages for men. That obviously is not really the right way to go. We want to lift the boat for everybody and not necessarily bring men's wages down to become more equal with women's wages. Then we need to look at the gender distribution of workers in different positions. And then we need really good evaluations of these different processes. What works best? How do companies comply? If they don't report, or if they report wrongly, what are the barriers? Is it too costly for them? Is it too complicated? Don't they have the data? Are the indicators not well set? Do they need more help? And then also the awareness obviously is very important. Next slide. Now, it's also important to say, what are the things that pay transparency cannot do? Well, first of all, you can have all the transparency in the world, but if there's no consequence to it, then obviously it's not going to help. So if the workers have no bargaining power, you can say, oh, but Mr. A is making much more money than Mrs. B, and they're doing the same thing. If you can't do anything about it, if you have no power, then this is not going to help. And so largely still we see that in countries, the individual who feels he or she is unfairly treated, it's their problem to do something about it. And so it's very much an individual responsibility, and we all know how difficult this can be and how scary it can be to go to your boss and say, look, I'm not happy because I think I should be paid more money. It's not an easy thing to do. So we need legal mechanisms for workers to seek recourse. We also need a streamlined access to justice. And it should not always be the individual, but if the employer should be also obliged to show that this is not the case if they believe that the worker is not making a fair case. Then we need objective criteria. That's normal. But that's why we have these pay transparency processes, and of course, and as we said before, it has to be part of a bigger strategy. Pay transparency can be a powerful tool, but we're not going to be able to eliminate the gender pay gap, which has so many different roots, just through pay transparency processes. But that said, I think it's it's a novel and it's a dynamic instrument. A lot is happening in this area, and that's why I'm really delighted that we're having this conversation today. And with that, I think I'm at the end. There we go. Here you have the cover of our report, which you can download. And I believe we also just posted it in the chat. So I would like to encourage you all to take a look and send us your new evidence if you do have it. We continue to work on it. Thank you. Thanks, Cairo.
Thank you, Ms. Kaiser. Next, we will hear from Manuela Tomei, the director of the ILO Conditions of Work and Equality Department. Ms. Tomei, you now have the floor.
Thank you so much, Cairo, and happy International Equal Pay Day to you all. I'm very pleased to be part of this great panel, and I'm happy to share with you the highlights of a recently released ILO study on pay transparency legislation, which was prepared in collaboration with the Faculty of Law of the University of Canterbury of New Zealand. We can show the PowerPoint. Next one, please. Next slide. So the study provides a mapping of existing equal pay legislation worldwide, and there are at present 21 countries that have adopted such a legislation. It reviews the findings of impact assessment studies of such law where those are available. It discusses the arguments in support of and against pay transparency law, while paying particular attention to the role of employers and workers' organizations in their implementation. In particular, and I think the value addition of this study lies in this particular aspect, is that the paper presents the findings of an online survey which was conducted with social partner organization at national and sectoral level between July and September 2021, and semi-structured interviews that were carried out between October and November 2021 in the 21 countries that have pay transparency laws in place. And the survey enabled a deeper understanding of how pay transparency measures are implemented in practice, and how employers and workers' organizations perceive their effectiveness and what, in their view, would help improve implementation. Next slide, please. The study reveals a great variety of approaches concerning the scope of the law. In other words, whether it is only private and or public enterprises that are covered, the size of the enterprises that fall under the remit of the law, the means and tools to implement the pay transparency law, which Monica has dealt with so comprehensively in her presentation, and also ways to ensure compliance with the law, such as the possibility of sanctions or fines in case of non-adherence to the law. And an increasing number of countries are providing for the recognition of employees' rights to request information on pay difference, and where such right is recognized, it is generally associated or exercised rather through a workers' representatives. Next slide. Despite the diversity of legal approaches across countries, consultations between employers and workers' representatives features in most national laws. And below on the slide, you will see a few country illustrations of the forms that such consultation can take. For instance, in Belgium, the employers develop and communicate the pay transparency report to the Work Council in the absence of such councils to a union delegate. And together, employers and workers examine the gender neutrality of the pay policy, and if any gaps are found, then an action plan is developed and implemented. In Spain, enterprises must include equal pay audits within their gender equality plans. This is for enterprises of a particular size. And audits are conducted with the involvement of employees' representatives and trade unions, and gender equality plans are negotiated within the enterprise by joint committees that comprise members, representatives of management and of workers. Next slide, please. Let me now zoom in on the views of employers and workers on pay transparency legislation, because these views and perceptions are quite important in terms of improving the actual implementation of the law. Survey responses of both employers and workers vary depending on the country, on the industrial relation systems in place, on the nature of the law. But in general, employers tended to consider equal pay or pay transparency law as effective and useful in terms of revealing or detecting possible discriminatory pay practices, and therefore, help address those discriminatory practices, and therefore improve also enterprise reputation, among other positive effects. Most respondents did not have a definitive view as to whether, as to the impact of equal pay wage transparency legislation, which somehow suggests that indeed it's quite difficult to attribute particular changes to an individual, to a single policy. Amongst the key obstacles that they identified as standing in the way of pay transparency laws were the additional administrative costs that they may entail, the fact that rules may not always be clear and processes may be cumbersome, and then the lack of inadequate information and guidance from national authorities, especially with regard to small-size enterprises. Another issue that was considered as rather challenging was identifying comparators in pay transparency reporting, and certainly practical tools for employers to facilitate job comparison also across different sectors would be rather helpful. Most employers responded indicated that they frequently or sometimes consulted workers on gender-related matters, including equal pay issues. Next, please. With regard to the workers' view, amongst the benefits that they identified featured the possibility of identifying potential discrimination in pay, and also the fact that it allows for better informed pay negotiations. Perceptions regarding the impact, the actual impact of this law in changing the conversation around equal pay issues depended very much by the countries concerned. So there was not a sort of unanimous view. As for the main obstacles that were cited as, again, standing in the way of effective implementation of pay transparency law, the majority pointed out the persistence of gender bias, social and cultural norms, as well as non-committed management. And interestingly, views differed regarding the effectiveness of voluntary policies versus more stringent regulations for the purpose of advancing gender equality in the workplace. So in a nutshell, it is too early, certainly, to assess the impact and effectiveness of pay transparency legislation, but growing number of countries are adopting it, and hence gatherings like those of today are extremely useful in terms of providing more inputs and insights on what could help enhancing their effectiveness. It's clear that, as Monica highlighted, pay transparency is just one tool in a battery of measures that should be relied upon to reduce the gender pay gap, that there is no one-size-fits-all solution, but country-tailored approaches. And interestingly, regardless of the route taken, it's very clear that employers and workers' organizations are key players, and that active social partnership, cooperation, dialogue at the workplace level, sectoral level, national level is crucial to delivering the intended results of pay transparency laws and measures. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing your reports with us. And what I heard from both of your presentations is that more countries need to not just ratify the ILO Equal Remuneration Convention 1951, number 100, but demonstrate their support for equal pay for work of equal value. by implementing legislation and policy practices to reduce gender discrimination in the workplace. But as we all know, and Ms. Tomei, you just shared, there's not a one-size-fits-all solution to enact pay transparency. So I'm actually excited to share with you that we have state and organization representatives who are here to elaborate their perspectives. And these are our esteemed panelists. It is truly an honor to be the moderator for this interactive panel discussion. There are questions that I personally had for our panelists when preparing for this panel, and I know that many of you may have your own questions that you would like to ask on the topic of pay transparency. And guess what? You will have an opportunity to ask our speakers directly during our Q&A between our panelists and amazing audience members like yourselves. As I moderate our panel, I ask that you write the questions that you may have for each speaker in the chat. So without further ado, please help me welcome our distinguished panelists. Now, please note, I will introduce each panelist one at a time, and I ask that all panelists turn their cameras off until they are called. Our first panelist is Her Excellency Sandra Hassan, Deputy Minister of Labour of Canada, on Canada's Employment Equity Report and Pay Equity Plan. Deputy Minister Hassan, over the past few years, the Government of Canada has implemented various proactive pay equity measures in an effort to eliminate pay gaps affecting not only women, but also Indigenous people, persons with disabilities, and members of minorities. Which of these would you say has had the most significant impact and why?
Thank you so much for this kind introduction, and many thanks to our friends at EPIC who have organized such an engaging event to celebrate the International Equal Pay Day. So the gender pay gap is a complex issue with many underlying causes. If you ask me, pay gap reporting and proactive pay equity are complementary initiatives. Together, they will both help reduce pay gaps. Proactive pay equity focuses on the gender wage gap and the under-evaluation of work traditionally performed by us women. Canada's Pay Equity Act, which came into force a year ago, is an important step forward. It will ensure that employers with 10 or more employees within the federally regulated workplace are providing equal pay for work of equal value. The Act requires that employers examine their compensation practices and make pay adjustments if necessary. This will mean that the industries it applies to will see sustainable progress towards gender pay equality. Pay gap reporting is a broader initiative in Canada that not only addresses pay gaps affecting women, but also Indigenous peoples, persons with disabilities, and members of visible minorities. It will apply to private sector organizations with 100 or more employees that are regulated by the federal government. So the employers report pay gaps that will then be made available to the public on an interactive website early next year. So we're starting in 2023. The website will provide the public with user-friendly, comparable information on the pay gaps of these 4 groups. Where I'm proud to say that we are going to be the first country in the world to publicly report on specific employer gaps between men and women, Indigenous peoples, persons with disabilities, and also members of visible minorities. By making this information publicly available, it will encourage employers to, first of all, identify the underlying causes. Second, to take action and show leadership in reducing the gaps where appropriate. And third, to create a more inclusive workplace. Our hope is that by everyone knowing about the facts about pay gaps, we will help to shift business culture and also expectations towards greater equality. These measures are in addition to other important changes our government is moving forward with, such as implementing workplace harassment and violence prevention regulations. Together, all of these efforts will help advance gender equality in the workplace and create workplaces where women will feel safe, valued, included, and secure. We believe that these are the conditions needed for women to be able to do their best work. This is good for employers, this is good for the economy, and it's good for all Canadians. Thank you.
Thank you. Wow, this is so exciting to know that Canada is going to be the first country to report publicly in this way. I will definitely be looking out for that launch next year. And I encourage everyone to also be looking out for this website information, because this is how we spread the word and this is how we influence more countries to also follow this example. Thank you so much. Next, we have Ms. Carmen Avila, the Director of Organizations and International Conferences of Panama's Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Ms. Avila, can you please tell us more about the National Plan for Equal Pay 2022 through 2025 of the Republic of Panama, which was presented this year in April 2022, and to which extent wage transparency measures are a part thereof? Ms. Avila?
Buenos días a todos. Buenos días, Erika. Feliz Día Internacional de la Igualdad Salarial 2022. Es un placer participar. El Plan Nacional por la Igualdad Salarial 2022-2025 establece las medidas con las que nos comprometemos como país, las cuales están dirigidas a acelerar nuestras acciones para lograr la transparencia y por ende la igualdad salarial. Nuestro compromiso parte de la convicción de que para lograr la igualdad salarial debemos remover las barreras estructurales que enfrentan las mujeres. La medida número 16 del plan explora de manera tripartita la posible implementación en el futuro de obligaciones de empleadores en materia de transparencia salarial, la cual dirige nuestras acciones a favor de la transparencia, al rendimiento de cuentas, a la creación de evidencia mediante herramientas dirigidas a conocer la situación actual y a incentivar estas acciones y que propicien un impacto importante hacia la igualdad salarial. Para cumplir con este propósito, nos encontramos trabajando en conjunto con diversas instituciones, medidas que van desde una encuesta nacional de remuneraciones, capacitaciones, campaña de sensibilización, incentivos para cumplir con buenas prácticas, establecimiento de normas de cumplimiento, entre otras. Nuestro compromiso con la igualdad salarial data del 2017, cuando nos sumamos a esta iniciativa. Es por esto que podemos decir que desde entonces hemos logrado avances significativos en la concienciación de la población y el compromiso del sector privado y público. Para alcanzar la igualdad salarial, nos corresponde sentar las bases que faciliten la elaboración de controles en nuestras instituciones, tanto públicas como privadas, con el objetivo de tomar decisiones basadas en datos cuantitativos y comprobables. El Día Internacional de la Igualdad Salarial representa para nosotros los esfuerzos constantes por conseguir una remuneración igualitaria para un trabajo de igual valor y la lucha por los derechos humanos y contra todas las formas de discriminación, incluida la discriminación contra las mujeres y las niñas. Muchas gracias.
Thank you so much, Ms. Avila. And it's true, I was actually writing down some notes as I was hearing the interpretation, and some of the methods that you listed included partnering with institutions, doing surveys on the topic of remuneration, as well as public campaigns. So these are practical steps that we can use to be able to reduce the gender pay gap and actually be able to uphold what we're sharing, which is equal pay for work of equal value. Thank you so much for sharing, Ms. Avila. Our next panelist is Ms. Irina Muzova, who is the Director for Equality and Union Citizenship for the European Commission. Ms. Muzova, in March 2021, the EU Commission submitted a legislative proposal for a pay transparency directive to strengthen the application of the principle of equal pay for work of equal value between men and women through pay transparency and enforcement mechanisms. The directive is still under negotiations, but could you please tell us what prompted the EU to take this action, and what are the key elements of this directive?
Well, thank you very much, Cairo, for this question, and also happy International Equal Pay Day to everybody. And thank you also, Rakesh, for inviting the European Commission here. As you know, so we are in Europe probably so facing similar issues and similar problems as the women and men over the whole world, but we are probably in a different stage. So let me just remind you also to our colleagues which are listening that the right to equal pay between women and men is actually already enshrined in the European Union treaties for more than 60 years. Yes, 60 decades. And as much as in other parts of the world, so women represent half of the European Union's population. And we know that in Europe, more women university graduates are than the men graduates. And that women's employment rate in the European Union is still higher today than ever before. But by saying that, so employment rate is higher than before. So in 2020, so when we have been preparing this proposal directive, so women's gross hourly earnings were still on average between the member states. You know that we have 27 member states. So on average, 13% below those of the men. Now, our latest evaluation, also from this year at the European Union Legal Framework, so the study that we have commissioned showed us that there is a serious implementation and enforcement issues also on the equal pay right. And we have heard from Monica from the OECD that these are actually the key issues looking at the gender pay gap. Now, this is also largely because of the lack of the basis information necessary to detect pay discrimination, and also the way how to react it. Because simply potential victims, they do not know that they are being discriminated. Now, these challenges that we have identified also were going hand in hand with the lack of the proper legal implementation of what constitutes pay or the work of equal value, and we just heard from Isla, and also the significant problems with access to justice, sometimes even the limiting possibilities of victims to redeem their rights. And we have heard about the possible fear of victimization that is having a kind of the deterrent effect, and actually also ineffective remedies that are not dissuasive, and they make it sometimes even pointless for the victims to go to justice to claim the rights. So that's why we have adopted in March 2021 this pay transparency proposal in order to end up this period where there have been empty rights without really ways of remedying them. And it is for us a process that can create also the mind shift in the workplace, because this is also very important. So how we have approached it, and you will find many of the elements that they've been actually raised already by Monica or by other speakers. So first, we are looking at empowerment of the workers to enforce their right to equal pay in the different stages. The first thing where we are looking at this is the period before being hired by the employer. Because all the applicants, according to our proposal, will have the right to know in advance the salary range offered for the position they are applying for. And from the other side, the employer, possible the future prospective employer, will not be allowed to ask for the applicant's salary history. And this will allow all applicants, without a difference of the sex, to enter into the salary negotiation on equal footing. And this is also well, we believe that it will break a trend of women's lower pay and sometimes timid negotiation, and ensure that systemic gender biases and undervaluation of the women's work are not perpetuated anymore. Now, the second part of the proposal focus on the period when the worker is already employed, because workers will have the right to receive information about how they pay compare with the average pay level of the colleagues doing the same work or the work of equal value, but those information should be broken by the sex. So then they can evaluate whether they are or whether may not be discriminated. But having the right to equal pay is not enough. And we have heard it also from the previous speakers, because the workers must also be able to enforce their rights. And that's why we further empower workers by facilitating their access to justice. And you know that workers are often in the vulnerable position. So we therefore enable also other bodies to come in favor of the individual worker, like equality bodies and also workers' representatives to act on their behalf. We also propose in our draft a kind of the collective claims on equal pay became possible, subject, of course, of the final result of the negotiation. And we also want for this initiative to trigger action by employers to address the systemic undervaluation of the women's work. Now, we have heard that there are different ways how to do it. And of course, this is a decision which is being taken by the legislator in terms, for example, of the size of the companies. So in the European Union case, so as a commission, so we propose large companies above 250 workers and above will have to report annually on the average pay gaps between women and men in the organization, of course, if any. And such information will be made public, so and also will help it raise awareness about equal pay issues and encourage employers to evaluate and monitor pay structures to ensure equal pay. Now, in the cases in these companies above 250 employers, where is a higher risk of unjustified pay inequalities identified, then in such cases, we suggest the employers are required to carry out a joint assessment of the internal situation together with the workers' representatives. This information, upon our suggestion, will not be made public, but will help identify reasons for such a pay differences and remedy the problem inside of the company. And if such actions are not enough, then comes the next step, and the discrimination case ends up in the court. And the proposed directive sets up a range of the remedies and penalties, because here we would like to inspire the member states. And here we are speaking about paying compensation to the worker, injunction orders to take structural or organizational measures at the level of the companies, fines towards the companies, or even, which is possible at the European level, exclusion from the participation in the public procurement procedures. Now, for the member states, there are also certain burdens, because they will have to ensure certain tools and methodologies that will be established to help employers assess and compare the value of work based on set objective criteria. Now, these tools and methodologies, as a rule, may include gender-neutral job evaluation and classification system, and this is also a big step forward. They will have the flexibility to decide how to do and how to organize, and they will also appoint, at the level of the member states, monitoring bodies to help ensuring the implementation. So this is also in the nutshell. So now that for the organization who will take time now to develop standards and philosophy around the compensation and pay transparency, we believe that they will be much better positioned to attract the top talents, and they be also leaders in the future. Let me conclude by that much remains to be done to bring full gender equality in the labor market. And we know that the pay transparency is not the full-fledged solution, but this is, from our perspective, the first necessary step. But alone, it is clearly not enough. But I do think, nevertheless, that by contributing to challenge and eliminating this gender stereotype and biases in the workplace, and also gaining the support from the employers, with this pay transparency measures will facilitate to pursue our tremendous goal, which is the closing the gender pay gap and ultimately help achieve gender equality in the whole society, so-called Union of Equality.
Wow, thank you so much for your answer. It was so comprehensive, and I actually wrote down some notes. So for example, some of the information in the directive would include, prior to employment, being able to share gender neutral wage classifications, making sure that employers are not asking for prior salary history so that they are able to get the pay for equal pay for work of equal value, as we've been sharing today during International Equal Pay Day. And just making sure that, for example, annual reports are accessible, and this is part of the compliance that companies and other sectors must be able to comply with in order to ensure that there is no gender discrimination when it comes to the workforce. So I appreciate what you shared with me, and I look forward to this directive being able to be launched. Thank you so much. We now have Ms. Anne Vaucher, Managing Director of European and International Affairs for MEDIF, Chair of IOE's Policy Working Group on Gender Equality and Diversity. Ms. Vaucher, my question for you is, how have employers been engaged in discussions around pay transparency, and what impact has been made in the workplace so far?
Good morning, afternoon, and evening, depending on where you are connecting from. And I'm delighted to participate in this epic event with more panelists to mark this International Equal Pay Day, and to speak as chair of IOE, Gender Equality and Diversity Policy Working Group. In order to go faster in my speech and my notes, I will turn and will switch in French, if it's possible. Pour commencer, je voudrais répéter à quel point les employeurs et les organisations d'employeurs sont engagés dans la lutte contre la discrimination de salaire et pour évidemment s'engager en faveur de la résolution de cette différence de salaire homme-femme. Bien sûr, elles ont déjà commencé à travailler sur ce sujet depuis de nombreuses années, et c'est leur responsabilité de faire respecter ce droit à une égalité professionnelle dans le contexte de leur entreprise, avec les partenaires sociaux quand ils existent, et de mettre en œuvre toutes les mesures, tous les outils nécessaires et qui soient adaptés à leur organisation en vue de mettre en œuvre et de façon efficace le principe d'égalité entre les hommes et les femmes. Comme cela a déjà été dit, la transparence de rémunération est un des très nombreux outils qui existent et qui permettent de réduire, de résoudre ce problème d'égalité de genre et ce problème d'inégalité de salaire qui peuvent exister. Il faut à ce moment-là des mesures qui soient raisonnables, qui soient proportionnelles et qui puissent être adaptées aux circonstances nationales, aux circonstances sectorielles et au niveau de l'entreprise. Alors, toutes ces mesures de transparence salariale pourront, si elles sont adaptées, si elles remplissent ces conditions, jouer un rôle important dans la différence des rémunérations hommes-femmes lorsqu'elles existent. Mais on sait aussi que ces politiques et ces mesures vont aider aussi à promouvoir le principe de l'égalité, à travail égal, salaire égal, qui est un principe qui est extrêmement compliqué à appliquer dans les entreprises. On a vu et on a entendu dans les différents rapports qui ont été cités que tous les pays dans le monde ne sont pas au même niveau sur ce sujet de la transparence de rémunération. Certains sont plus avancés que d'autres. Il faut une certaine maturité. Il faut aussi des conditions qui sont nécessaires. Et effectivement, une des questions qui a été posée, c'est quid de la difficulté dans les pays où il y a de l'informalité. Voilà, il y a d'autres sujets qui font que ces mesures ne peuvent pas être appliquées partout, en même temps, par tous, de la même façon. Cela revient finalement un peu à dire aussi que s'il y a donc des mesures de transparence de rémunération qui peuvent être un des outils, nous considérons, organisation d'employeurs, que pour avancer sur la mise en œuvre du principe de rémunération égale, eh bien, il y a d'autres mesures qui doivent être mises en œuvre avec les politiques, avec les partenaires sociaux et qui doivent finalement permettre de résoudre les vraies causes de l'inégalité de genre qui existent. Et donc, je vais citer tout de même quelques points qui me paraissent importants, qui sont bien sûr d'augmenter la participation des femmes dans le marché du travail et on doit s'y employer tous les jours en tant qu'employeur, en tant qu'organisation d'employeurs. Il faut absolument continuer à poursuivre et à augmenter cette participation des femmes au marché du travail. Il faut s'assurer que le système d'éducation dans tous les pays promeuvent une égalité de genre. On voit souvent que dans l'éducation, à l'école, certains métiers sont plus mis en avant que d'autres. Ça doit être absolument, on doit absolument s'assurer que ce sont une éducation neutre. On doit aussi continuer à parler des stéréotypes de genre et à lutter contre les stéréotypes de genre. On doit bien sûr aussi s'assurer que dans tous les États, il existe des systèmes de garde d'enfants qui aident les parents et qui aideront bien sûr aussi les femmes, mais il faut aussi qu'il y ait une égalité mieux répartie entre les hommes et les femmes dans la gestion justement des enfants. Et puis, il faut continuer à promouvoir un discours positif sur toutes les opportunités économiques et d'emploi qui existent pour les femmes partout dans le monde. Une fois que l'on aura aussi travaillé sur tous ensemble, parce que ce ne sont pas seulement les organisations d'employeurs et des employeurs, mais toutes les parties prenantes doivent travailler, tous les citoyens doivent travailler dans cette dimension, alors cela permettra déjà de résoudre une des raisons, enfin une des fondations d'une possible divergence de rémunération entre les hommes et les femmes. Je veux juste maintenant indiquer dans les pays où il y a déjà eu, et là je vais parler aussi un peu de mon expérience au niveau français, rapidement donner les 3-4 conditions qui nous semblent nécessaires à appliquer pour mettre en œuvre des pratiques ou des politiques ou des législations de transparence de rémunération.
Excuse me, Ms. Boucher. Ms. Boucher, apologies, but if you can please say your answer, respond to the question again. I will ask the question one more time. If you can please slow down when you speak so that our interpreters can be able to hear you, because everyone wants to hear your response. No problem, no problem.
Sorry, I'm sorry.
No problem, Ms. Boucher. Okay, so what we're going to do, and there's a problem with the sound a bit. So I'll try this again, Ms. Rocher. My question for you is, how have employers been engaged in discussions around pay transparency, and what impact has been made in the workplace so far? And if you could please respond back a little bit slower, so that way our interpreters can be able to hear and make sure that everyone around the world can be able to understand your response. Thank you so much. And if you could please speak a little louder as well.
Ok. J'espère que vous m'entendez mieux. Is it better now?
We can hear you better, Ms. Boucher.
Ok. Okay, sorry. Donc, il nous semble que de nombreuses mesures peuvent être mises en œuvre pour réduire cette différence de rémunération. Et j'expliquais que les différentes mesures peuvent être prises, des mesures de transparence salariale, mais également d'autres mesures qui sont nécessaires et dont tous les acteurs doivent s'emparer pour mettre en place. Je citais dans cette liste à la fois effectivement augmenter la participation des femmes au marché du travail et essayer d'enlever tous les obstacles à cette participation des femmes au marché du travail dans des métiers qui peuvent être des techniques, mais de façon générale aussi. S'assurer qu'une éducation, qu'à l'école et dans les systèmes éducatifs, il y a une égalité de genre qui est promue. Poursuivre des campagnes de prise en compte de l'impact des stéréotypes de genre qui sont nécessaires. Également, travailler en lien avec les États pour faciliter les infrastructures de garde d'enfants et aussi continuer à porter un message positif sur l'implication des femmes, des opportunités économiques pour les femmes dans tous ces métiers. Et j'étais en train de dire que lorsque les États ont mis en œuvre des politiques ou des législations en matière de transparence salariale, nous considérons, comme cela a été dit, qu'il n'y a pas une approche la plus pertinente, qu'elle doit être adaptée évidemment à tous les différents pays, mais qu'il nous apparaît qu'il y a 4 conditions à respecter afin que ces mesures soient utiles, efficaces et qu'elles changent les choses sur le terrain. Parce qu'à la fin, la transparence, elle est utile si elle permet de progresser. Les 4 conditions que l'on a définies sont les suivantes. La première, c'est que les organisations d'employeurs et les entreprises doivent participer à la consultation sur ces politiques et ces mesures, parce qu'à la fin, il revient toujours aux entreprises de mettre en œuvre ces mesures. Donc, elles doivent jouer leur rôle et être en amont intégrées. La deuxième condition, c'est que les partenaires sociaux doivent jouer leur rôle et ils ont souvent déjà des compétences et dans cette matière et des prérogatives qui doivent être absolument respectées. La troisième condition, c'est qu'il faut éviter de créer des charges administratives trop importantes pour les entreprises et essayer de repartir soit de données que l'entreprise a déjà, soit d'accompagner en tous les cas le développement de ces mesures de transparence afin d'en limiter les impacts négatifs pour les entreprises. Et le quatrième condition, c'est qu'il faut qu'il y ait une progressivité et qu'on ne peut pas demander poser les mêmes obligations pour les grandes entreprises et les petites. Il faut donc une progressivité et aussi tenir compte des difficultés que peuvent avoir les très petites entreprises dans la mise en œuvre de ces mesures de transparence. Si toutes ces quatre conditions sont remplies, alors nous considérons que ces mesures de transparence, ces législations sur la transparence ou ces politiques de transparence de salaire peuvent être très positives et faire progresser fortement la différence entre les hommes et les femmes. Voilà, je m'arrêterai là et j'espère que vous avez pu m'entendre. Et je suis désolée.
We heard you very loud and clearly. Thank you so much. And actually, some of the points that you made that were so important is, for example, recognizing in these gender campaigns, childcare and unpaid labor. So being able to have childcare in place, for example, because that helps to reduce the gender pay gap. It's interesting because UN Women actually has an unpaid care labor calculator that shares that about on average globally, men do about 4 years of unpaid labor versus women who do about 10 years of unpaid labor globally around the world. So we see, for example, that if child care is a solution, it helps to mitigate some of the disparities when it comes to some of these unpaid labor. So thank you so much for sharing that, as well as it's important to take into account the implementation of these policies when it comes to the sizes of the corporation. So if it's a smaller company of 3 employees versus a corporation of thousands of employees, it will take it. There's no one size fits all solution, which is what we have been talking about today. And I think that you really were able to share that and nail that point in. So thank you so much, Ms. Fauché. And our last, you're so welcome. Thank you. We're so happy we could hear you and understand. All right, our last panelist is Ms. Karen Palma, who is the Vice President for the Workers United Center of Chile. Ms. Palma, over the past decades, gender equality in Chile has advanced along several important dimensions, including in significantly reducing the gender pay gap. What was the role of trade unions therein, and which steps are you planning to take in the future?
Sí, bueno, saludar esta tremenda instancia de participación de las organizaciones y bueno, de todo el mundo en este Día Internacional por la Igualdad Salarial, en que también hay un reconocimiento al rol de la CCI que insta a los gobiernos a adoptar leyes y reformas para reducir la brecha salarial que está hoy día casi en el 20%. Comentar algunas cosas particularmente de Chile. Es importante abordar esta problemática en un país en que efectivamente, tal como lo ha visto el mundo después de la pandemia sociosanitaria que hemos vivido, el trabajo de las mujeres ha retrocedido casi 10 años y efectivamente instalar el tema de igualdad salarial, transparencia en los salarios y en los roles que se establecen dentro de las empresas como de la administración pública se hace fundamental. Bueno, en Chile nosotros tenemos hace 4 años ya la iniciativa de una ley que buscaba generar igualdad salarial, buscaba generar igualdad salarial entre hombres y mujeres. Además, también la transparencia, no solo en el tema salarial, sino que también en la distribución de los cargos de poder dentro de las empresas y la administración pública. Y también tenía como marco incentivar políticas públicas que apoyaran la equidad de género en el mundo de las empresas y en el sector público, y un punto no menor que era la difusión y la capacitación de una sociedad informada, porque entendíamos que mientras las mujeres y los hombres tuvieran conocimiento de esta desigualdad histórica, también se iba a generar una instancia de concientización de esta problemática que abarca a los países. Lamentablemente, después de 4 años de la evaluación, podemos decir que si bien hemos avanzado en algunas materias, hoy día todavía tenemos deficiencia en lo que ha sido el tema de la igualdad salarial, porque claro, el instrumento lo que buscaba era que empresas transparentaran el rol que han tenido, el rol en el tránsito, en esta igual trabajo, igual paga, pero solo se limitó a grandes empresas, dejando oculta una realidad que en la mayoría hoy día no llegamos a eso. Por lo tanto, en la actualidad en Chile existen 8 iniciativas legislativas que buscan fortalecer esta legislación y empujar a una real transparencia de todo el universo de empresas y de sector público en la idea de poder construir una real igualdad de salario y una igualdad en la participación en las mujeres en el mundo del trabajo. También quisiera relevar algunas problemáticas que van ligadas directamente. Escuchaba la intervención anterior, hoy día Chile también está apostando a lo que es el sistema nacional de cuidados, un sistema integral de cuidados, porque las mujeres no solo cargan con el cuidado de los hijos e hijas, sino que también de adultos mayores, de personas en situación de discapacidad, y eso efectivamente altera el empleo. Por lo tanto, y las condiciones de empleabilidad. Por lo tanto, hoy día, si nosotros somos capaces de mirar el sistema de cuidado, también lo que ha significado la brecha cultural que tienen los países, sobre todo de Latinoamérica, es necesario abordar todas estas problemáticas cuando nosotros queremos instalar en este tema. También ver otro factor no menor y que tiene que ver con la situación de las familias. Hoy día nuestro país sitúa en casi más del 50% de familias monoparentales. Eso quiere decir que la madre es la que aporta el principal sustento. Y también decir que en esta medición de salario mínimo, efectivamente las mujeres tienen mucha más, mucha más incidencia en lo que es o son más beneficiarias del salario mínimo que los hombres. Entonces, cuando uno mira esta desigualdad en el mundo del trabajo, efectivamente entiende que tenemos muchos desafíos que hacer. Y creo que hoy día uno de los desafíos más importantes es abordar de una forma integral esta problemática del cuidado, del desempleo, de la situación de la crisis económica en el mundo en el mundo del trabajo, y en especial énfasis en cómo hoy día somos capaces de incorporar más mujeres al mundo del trabajo, y también de hacer un reconocimiento histórico a las labores que hasta la fecha no han sido reconocidas, como son las labores del cuidado y este trabajo que ha sido tan invisibilizado. Creemos importante también que hoy día, más que nunca, la sociedad pueda avanzar en poder abordar estas problemáticas, porque cuando vienen las crisis sociales y las crisis económicas, efectivamente las mujeres tenemos un rol fundamental que ocupar. Y ahí yo quiero valorar también que hoy día, dentro de las organizaciones internacionales, tanto la CCA como la CCI, estén abordando a propósito de la ratificación del Convenio 100 y de su múltiple práctica, porque las organizaciones sindicales puedan juntarse y puedan activar temáticas que en muchos países no son de primera línea. Creemos fundamental que hoy día estos temas se pongan en el tapete y también puedan estar puestos en las agendas futuras a propósito de la situación actual en el empleo. Gracias.
Thank you so much for your response, Ms. Palma. And you know, you have been able to elaborate a lot more, especially from your context in Chile. For example, some of the legislative policies that need to be in place to help all companies and enterprises, regardless of company size, be able to enact pay transparency measures, and that it is important to recognize that there's more support needed for women in the workplace, because there are women, for example, who are single mothers who have to take care of their children and also bring in a living for their families as well. So unfortunately, at this time, we are not able to answer any or have any additional Q&A from the chat. We see, for example, some of my colleagues at EPIC and ILO have been answering questions and putting links in the chat, and I hope that this has been able to answer many of the questions that you have. Unfortunately, we've run out of time for additional Q&A, but at this time, I do ask that all speakers please turn on your cameras. Ms. Palma, please be sure to keep your camera on. We're going to do a picture with all of our speakers. It's wonderful to get to see your faces. See. Fantastic. Ms. Muzova, would you be so kind to turn on your camera too, so we can see your face?
I would like to, however, it is said that I'm blocked by the organizer.
Ah, okay. All right. If someone can please turn on, allow Ms. Muzova to also share her camera, as well as Mr. Patri. I think that is everyone. Fantastic.
Still cannot your video because the host has stopped it.
Now we can see your face. Fantastic. Absolutely. We could not take this picture without you. Fantastic. Thank you so much. And I just want to take a brief moment to thank our audience for your thoughtful and thought-provoking questions in the chat. I was really enjoying reading your comments and seeing, for example, how you are going to be bringing International Equal Pay Day to your universities, to your communities. I also want to thank you for your participation. I would like to also extend my gratitude to our illustrious and high-profile presenters for taking time out of their busy schedules to represent their states and organizations on this very important topic of pay transparency on International Equal Pay Day. So thank you so much. But before we close today's event, we will now hear from Ms. Simi Kayoum, who is a policy advisor for sustainable development and OIC economic empowerment for UN Women. As a representative from UN Women, Ms. Kayoum will now summarize the key messages emanating from the event based on today's presentation and dynamic panel discussion. So I'm going to ask, yes, fantastic, if you could please go ahead and tell us what are some of the key takeaways that we should take from today's session.
Thank you so much, Cairo, and for all of the participants and speakers today for a truly inspiring and informative session that shows us the path forward. On behalf of UN Women, I'm delighted to celebrate International Equal Pay Day, which is, as we all know, a key and central issue for achieving gender equality and the empowerment of all women everywhere. And this multi-stakeholder partnership that is EPIC aims to accelerate achievement of equal pay for work of equal value by 2030. As the speakers today have all in different ways highlighted, progress has been made to reduce the gender pay gap and other gender gaps, but we are still very far from achieving the Sustainable Development Goals, including SDG 5 on gender equality and SDG 8.5 on equal pay for work of equal value. Not only has the COVID-19 pandemic exacerbated existing inequalities, foremost gender inequalities, but the cost of living crisis has jeopardized women's economic autonomy. Women earn 20% less than men across the globe on average, with far-reaching repercussions for women workers, their families, employers, and society more broadly. Many approaches can be taken to reduce the gender pay gap, but as the speakers today have outlined, promoting pay transparency is key, and this has elicited significant interest from governments and other stakeholders. ILO's recent paper on pay transparency legislation outlines the main types of pay transparency measures, including employer pay gap reporting, equal pay audits and their consequences, job evaluation classification systems that target gendered occupational segregation, and discussions of equal pay and collective bargaining, strengthening women workers' rights to data and information on pay and ensuring compliance, and better monitoring and evaluation to see what works and what doesn't, and tracking progress in countries. Speakers highlighted how pay transparency allows for and is a critical component of constructive partnerships. The OECD noted that pay gap reporting and pay auditing processes give workers and their representatives more information to advocate for equal pay for work of equal value. Gender disaggregated information allows for stakeholders to drill down to see where differences arise. OECD also stressed the importance of compliance, visibility, and follow-up actions. If there are no consequences to pay inequalities and workers have no bargaining power, then pay transparency measures won't help. Indeed, active social partnerships, for example, cooperation and dialogue between employers and workers, are necessary to enact and implement pay transparency legislation and measures and produce results. As such, the Government of Canada highlighted the Proactive Pay Equity Act, public pay gap reporting that includes not only the pay gap and differences between men and women, but those involving Indigenous peoples, disabled people, and visible minorities. The Government of Panama discussed its national plan for equal pay that removes structural barriers and discrimination that women face, centered on pay transparency to achieve pay equity and securing commitments from the public and private sectors. The European Commission emphasized that equal pay has been a part of EU treaties for 60 years, but in 2020, the gender pay gap still was 13%. Pointing to serious implementation issues, including lack of information and knowledge about pay discrimination, about rights, access to justice, and effective remedies, which has led to the 2021 Pay Transparency Directive that is being negotiated. The movement of the enterprises of France, MEDEF, showed how employers are involved in working towards pay equity together with other social partners. Pay transparency is central to gender equality and equal pay and needs to be contextualized and adapted to national and sectoral conditions. The complexity of implementation means that not all countries have the capacity to apply pay transparency in the same way and to the same level. MEDEF also stressed that gender discrimination needs to be redressed across society to ensure that women have equal economic and educational opportunities and benefit from them, highlighting the need to reduce and redistribute women's unpaid care and domestic work, including through provision of childcare services. Noting that employer organizations need to participate in the development and implementation of pay transparency, and social partners also need to be involved and respected. Attention needs to be paid to reducing administrative burdens, and implementation needs to be progressive depending on the size and nature of the enterprises. The United Workers Central of Chile, CUT, stressed the need for governments to enact laws and measures to reduce the gender pay gap, noting the impact of COVID in pushing back progress on gender equality by 10 years. CUT underscored the importance of information and awareness raising about equal pay and pay transparency, noting that Chile has advanced, but challenges remain. One of them is a focus on only large companies and the need to support all companies to adopt and implement pay transparency, highlighting the care crisis, noting that Chile has a national care system, but the challenges are especially acute for single-parent households, where the issues of minimum wages and increasing women's access to quality jobs and quality employment is imperative. So it is clear from today's vibrant discussion that achieving equal pay for work of equal value is an integral part of addressing gender inequalities, and that can only be done through proactive pay transparency measures in the public and private sectors. Having the right to equal pay is not enough. Workers must be able to enforce this right. I thank the EPIC chair, Mr. Rakesh Patri, the steering committee and EPIC members, our esteemed panelists, and of course, all of the participants for joining our event today online. It is through your continued solidarity and partnership that we will make progress on achieving equal pay for work of equal value. Thank you again, and back to you, Cairo.
Thank you so much, Ms. Kayoum. And I just have to say that was a fantastic summary and comprehensive overview of all that we talked about today. I can't believe that our presentation and our event today for International Equal Pay Day is just coming so close to a close. I mean, even as the moderator and host, I thoroughly enjoyed today's topic, the perspectives provided, and the opportunities to learn best practices and ways of thinking that I myself can take back and integrate into my day-to-day life. And I'm confident that I'm not the only one. I want to ask you, what was one takeaway that you had from today's event after listening to our incredibly knowledgeable speakers and panelists? Please write in the chat. You know, for me, I was able to hear from today's speakers as they shared how pay transparency is a powerful tool to examine and address gender discrimination. And I love the opportunity to hear firsthand from our panelists on how they have been implementing or how they intend to further implement policies that reduce inequalities in the workplace. I personally feel inspired by today's event, and I hope you have as well. At this time, I also want to thank EPIC and ILO for allowing me to be your moderator for today's panel. Thank you so much for giving me the opportunity as a youth to engage in this informative, intergenerational, intercultural exchange as to what it means to have transparency, pay transparency, and how we can work together to reduce the gender pay gap. Now, you might be wondering after today's amazing event, I fully support the mission of EPIC, but what can I do to show my support? Here are 3 ways. One way is that we ask that you please reach out to your respective governments and organizations to join EPIC and stay connected to upcoming events and initiatives that EPIC has. How do you join? It's easy. Simply visit our website, www.equalpayinternationalcoalition.org. That's equalpayinternationalcoalition.org, and click on the red button, Join EPIC. There's a short application to submit in order to be considered. A second way, we have some incredible news for you today. Just yesterday, EPIC launched a community sharing portal, which is a new private space where EPIC members will have the opportunity to share knowledge and exchange on topics relevant to equal pay for work of equal value. So EPIC members, please check your mailboxes and click on the link so that you can join the conversation. And participants, you guessed it, the first topic will actually be on the issue of pay transparency. So please note that this rich conversation that we started today will continue on the portal. Is your government or organization an EPIC member as yet? Remember, you can apply as an EPIC member today to take part in this inclusive community platform. It's not too late. We want you all to be EPIC members. Simply go to the EPIC website, www.equalpayinternationalcoalition.org, and click on the Join EPIC button. The third way, lastly, we ask that you tweet about today's event using #EqualPayDay. Please share one takeaway that you received from this event and tag @EPIC2030, as well as @ILO, @UN_women, and @OECD. The celebration to raise awareness of International Equal Pay Day today should still go on long after this event ends. My name is Kyra Eubanks, and I want to wish each and every one of you today, Happy International Equal Pay Day, everyone. Thank you for being here.